Hello, dear readers. Welcome to another journey through the forgotten pages of our history. Today we will dive into a narrative that transports us to Imperial Brazil of 1849, where the coffee plantations of the Paraíba Valley witnessed one of the most touching stories of honesty and redemption ever told. Among the morning mists and the perfume of coffee blossoms, we will meet Benedita Joaquina da Conceição, a widow who, faced with the greatest temptation of her life, chose virtue over survival. A story that teaches us that sometimes losing everything is the first step to finding our true wealth. Before we begin, tell me, where are you joining us from? Leave your city in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. This helps us a lot to continue bringing these exciting stories to you. Now, close your eyes and let yourself be carried away by the distant echoes of Brazil in 1849, in the fertile lands of the Paraíba Valley, province of Rio de Janeiro. About year 1849, Paraíba Valley, interior of the province of Rio de Janeiro. The Treehouse. The morning mist danced lazily among the coffee plantations when Benedita Joaquina da Conceição raised her eyes to the sky that was beginning to clear. Her calloused hands, molded by 3 years of incessant work, firmly held the small bundle of wet clothes she had just taken from the stream. The smell of damp earth mixed with the sweet perfume of coffee flowers, creating an olfactory symphony that had long ceased to bring her any comfort. At 30 years old, Benedita carried on her shoulders the weight of 6 lives that depended entirely on her. A widow for 3 years since yellow fever had taken her Geraldo on some March afternoon, she had learned to transform mourning into strength, tears into determination. Her children, Felisberto, 14 years old, Catarina, 11, the twins Manuel and Jose, 9, little Antonia, 6, and the youngest Benedito, 3, had not seen her cry even once since their father's burial. The mud and stick house where they lived, built in the back of Colonel Augusto de Almeida Barros's property, seemed even more fragile under the golden light of dawn. 3 small rooms, packed earth floor carefully swept every morning, walls that let in the cold of dawn and the suffocating heat of summer afternoons. It was all that remained of a life that had once known better days. The sound of heavy footsteps on the dirt trail made Benedita lift her head. She immediately recognized the robust silhouette of Joaquim, the colonel's foreman, coming toward her with a paper in his hand and an expression that boded nothing good. "Donna Benedita," his harsh voice cut through the morning silence like a knife. "The colonel sent this for you." She dried her hands on her faded calico apron before receiving the paper. She couldn't read, but she recognized the numbers scribbled in ink. $250,000. 250,000 reis. An impossible sum for someone like her. "It's the debt your late husband left," continued Joaquim, without a hint of compassion in his voice. "The colonel was kind not to collect during these 3 years, but now he needs the money. And the land, too." The words echoed in her mind like stones thrown into a deep well. Debt. Land. Her Geraldo had never mentioned any debt. How could he owe such a fortune to a man he barely knew? "Until when?" was all she managed to murmur, her voice almost inaudible. "Until noon on Ash Wednesday. 5 days. If you don't pay, you'll have to leave the property." Joaquim made a calculated pause. "The colonel offers an alternative. You can leave the oldest boy to work on the farm, as a tenant." The word tenant sounded like a life sentence. Benedita knew the fate of tenants on the farms. Work from sun to sun, without wages, bound to the land by debts they could never pay off. It wasn't much different from slavery, just with another name. "No." The word left her lips with a firmness that surprised her. "My children stay with me." Joaquim shrugged and walked away, leaving her alone with the weight of that revelation. Benedita carefully folded the paper and put it in her apron pocket. 5 days. How could someone who earned a few pennies washing clothes and embroidering in exchange for flour gather a fortune? The sun was already high when she finished hanging the clothes on the improvised clothesline between 2 guava trees. Her movements were methodical, precise, as if routine could drive away the thoughts that tormented her. But there was something different in the air that morning, a tension that even Benedito, playing with pieces of wood in the dirt, seemed to feel. Catarina appeared at the house door, her brown hair pinned in a bun that made her look older than her 11 years. "Mother, what did Joaquim want?" Benedita looked at her daughter, those clever eyes that saw everything, that had matured too quickly in the face of family needs. How to explain that they might have to leave the only home they knew, how to say that the fragile stability they had achieved was about to crumble. "Nothing much, daughter. Let's go inside. It's time for lunch." But in truth, while serving the watery beans and the small piece of bacon to each child, Benedita knew that everything had changed, and that a storm much bigger than any summer rain was about to fall on their heads. That night, after all the children fell asleep, she knelt before the image of Our Lady of Sorrows and began to pray. Her words, whispered like secrets, rose through the clay chimney toward the distant stars, carrying all the anguish of a mother who didn't know how to protect her children from the approaching storm. The 3 years that followed Geraldo's death had been a painful learning in the art of survival. Benedita always woke at the first rooster's crow, when the world was still wrapped in the cozy darkness of dawn. Her hands, which once knew only how to embroider delicate flowers on batiste handkerchiefs, learned to mold ash soap, to spin cotton until late hours, and to carry heavy bundles of dirty clothes to the stream. The stream, there she spent entire mornings, kneeling on smooth stones, scrubbing coarse cotton fabrics while listening to the constant murmur of water. It was work that bruised her knees and cracked her hands, but brought some essential pennies to buy cassava flour and the little brown sugar that sweetened the children's lives. During the afternoons, when the sun beat down mercilessly, she would retreat to the shade of the house to embroider. Her fingers danced over the fabric with a delicacy that contrasted with the harshness of her life, creating impossible flowers in colors that would never fade. The village ladies paid well for her embroidery, recognizing in them a quality that rivaled work from the court. Felisberto, the oldest, had become a little man at 14. He helped with the coffee harvest when the season came, carrying heavy baskets uphill under the stern gaze of the overseers. His back was beginning to curve prematurely, and his hands already bore the marks of coffee bush thorns. Benedita watched her son work with a mixture of pride and sadness, pride for the boy's dedication, sadness to see him lose his childhood so early. Caterina cared for the younger siblings with a maternal affection that touched the heart of anyone who saw her. She taught first letters to Antonia, using a piece of charcoal on an old board, and sang lullabies to Benedito when the nights were too long. The girl had a sweet voice that echoed through the small house, bringing a bit of music to days that seemed made only of work. The twins Manuel and José were like two halves of one soul, smart and curious. They explored every corner of the colonel's property, knowing every trail, every tree, every hiding place. They brought wild fruits home when hunger pressed, and dry wood for the stove when rains made searching for fuel difficult. During these 3 years, Colonel Augusto de Almeida Barros had maintained a respectful distance. He was an imposing man, with full mustaches and always impeccable clothes, who owned several farms throughout the region and had influence even at court. His visits to the property were rare, but when he appeared, everyone bowed in reverence. Benedita always greeted him with a respectful nod, grateful that he allowed them to remain on the land. Now, however, faced with that paper with impossible numbers, she was beginning to understand that the colonel's apparent kindness had been just a trap. Letting the debt grow with interest for 3 years, it was a refined cruelty, a way of ensuring it could never be paid off. On the eve of Carnival, while listening to the distant sounds of festivities coming from the village, Benedita sat on the doorstep and watched her children play in the yard. Felisberto was carving a small wooden horse for Benedito. The twins were building an ingenious bird trap. Caterina was teaching Antonia to make corn dolls. It was a scene of simple peace, a modest happiness built with love and resignation. How could she destroy that? How could she uproot them from there and take them where? She had no relatives, nowhere to go. Barra do Piraí was the nearest village, 4 leagues away, but what kind of life could they have there? A woman alone with 6 children, without a penny in her pocket. The smell of coffee that women prepared in neighboring houses reached her, carried by the night breeze. It was an aroma that had always comforted her, but that night it brought only the bitter memory that all of that, the land, the work, the fragile security, depended on the will of a man who had never lifted a finger to help her. When everyone retired, she remained awake spinning cotton by the light of a tallow candle. Her fingers worked automatically, twisting the soft fibers into resistant threads, while her mind tried to find a solution that simply didn't exist. 250,000 reis, a fortune she would never see in her lifetime. At 2 in the morning, when even the crickets seemed to have tired of singing, she finally lay down beside Benedito, who slept with a serene smile on his face. And there, in the darkness that preceded the storm, Benedita Joaquina de Conceição made the decision that would change the destiny of her entire family. She would not allow them to separate her children. Whatever happened, they would stay together. It was all they had left, and it was more valuable than any amount of gold. Outside, the wind began to blow stronger, as if nature itself sensed that an irreversible change was about to happen. The February afternoon was suffocating, loaded with that heavy humidity that precedes the great summer storms. The air seemed like hot jelly, sticking to the skin and making breathing difficult. Benedita was hanging the last batch of clothes on the line when she heard the unmistakable sound of horses approaching along the dirt trail. It wasn't an ordinary visitor. The rhythm of the hooves, the slow and authoritative cadence, announced the presence of someone important. She dried her hands on her apron and turned to see Colonel Augusto de Almeida Barros himself dismounting, followed by two men she didn't recognize, one wearing city clothes, another with the rigid posture of someone accustomed to enforcing orders. The colonel was even more imposing seen up close. Tall, corpulent, with those greyish moustaches carefully trimmed, and a belly that betrayed years of good meals. He wore a fine cloth coat despite the heat, and his small eyes gleamed with the coldness of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Donna Benedita," his voice echoed across the yard like the roar of a large animal. "I imagine you received my message." She made a respectful curtsy, as she had learned since childhood when addressing employers. "I did, Colonel, but I don't understand this debt. My Geraldo never spoke to me about—" "Your husband borrowed money to plant a larger corn crop. It was March 1846, remember?" The colonel took a paper from his coat pocket. "Here's the receipt, signed by him. 150,000 reis at 2% interest per month." Benedita looked at the paper without being able to decipher the letters, but the trembling signature at the end did seem to be Geraldo's. How was it possible? Why had he never mentioned this debt? "It's been 3 years, Donna Benedita. The account has grown." The city-dressed man spoke for the first time, his voice charged with an education that made his words even more cutting. 250,000 reis, a considerable sum. "I don't have that money, you know that." The words left her mouth like a painful confession. "I work from sun to sun and can barely keep the children fed." The colonel exchanged a meaningful look with his companions. It was a look she knew well, the look of someone who had already decided everything before the conversation even began. "That's why I'm offering a solution." He approached a few steps, and she could smell the expensive tobacco that permeated his clothes. "Your oldest son stays here as a tenant. He'll work to pay off the debt. He's a strong boy in 5 or 6 years. "No." The word left her lips before she could even think. "My children stay with me." The silence that followed was heavy as melted lead. The twins, who were playing near the house, stopped to observe the conversation. Caterina appeared at the door with Benedito in her arms, and even Felisberto, who was coming from the pasture where he helped guide the cattle, felt the tension in the air. "Then pay the debt by noon tomorrow," said the colonel, his voice now stripped of any pretense of cordiality, "or leave the land. I have other plans for this area." It was then that she understood. It wasn't about the debt. It never had been. The colonel wanted the land where they lived. That spring that never dried up, even in the cruelest summers, was perfect for expanding his coffee-drying yard. The debt was just a legal pretext, an elegant way to expel them without appearing cruel. "Tomorrow is Ash Wednesday," she murmured, more to herself than to the men. "Exactly. A new day. A fresh start." The colonel smiled, but there was no warmth whatsoever in that smile. For all of us. After the men left, raising a cloud of dust that took time to settle, Benedita remained standing in the same place, looking toward the trail where they had disappeared. The children approached slowly, sensing that something terrible had happened but not daring to ask. Felisberto was the first to break the silence. "Mother, do we have to leave here?" She looked at her son, that still young face but already marked by responsibilities, those shoulders that carried burdens too heavy for his age. How to explain that the world is sometimes cruel to the defenseless? How to say that justice doesn't always exist for the poor? "Perhaps, my son, perhaps." That night she gathered all the children in the small living room and told them the truth. There was no point in hiding. They were smart enough to understand and brave enough to face whatever came. She explained about the debt, about the need to leave, about the uncertainty that awaited them. Caterina cried silently. Antonia asked questions she couldn't answer. The twins remained mute with shock. Only Benedito, too small to understand the magnitude of what was happening, continued playing with his wooden horse. "We're going to stay together," she said. pulling them all close to her. "Whatever happens, we're going to stay together." Outside, the first gusts of wind announced that the summer storm was approaching, but Benedita knew that the real storm had already arrived, and that the next morning they would be walking toward the unknown, carrying only the certainty of the love that united them. The eve of a new time had arrived, and with it the courage of a mother willing to face any adversity to protect her children. The matins still echoed in the air when Benedita woke the children in the darkness of dawn. There was no more time for tears or lamentations, only the practical urgency of gathering the little they possessed and leaving before the sun rose completely. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded the children's clothes, but her voice remained firm when giving instructions. "Caterina, take your grandmother's quilts. Felisberto, fill the bag with the flour that's left and the bacon. Twins, you carry the saints from the wall." Each chosen object told a story. The calico quilt her mother had embroidered for the wedding, the image of St. Joseph that had protected the family since before Felisberto's birth, the small wooden chest where she kept her embroidery needles, and the few colored threads that still remained. It was an entire life reduced to 2 bundles of coarse fabric and a worn leather bag. The sky was beginning to clear when they left the mud and stick house for the last time. Benedita didn't look back. She knew that if she did, she might lose the courage she had built during the sleepless night. Benedita went in her arms, still drowsy, while the others walked in silent file along the trail they knew by heart. Barra de Piraí was 4 leagues away, along the royal road that cut through the coffee farms. It was a path she had traveled few times in her life, always accompanied by Geraldo when they went to sell some production or buy supplies they couldn't produce. Now the same road seemed infinitely longer, more uncertain. The first rays of golden sun cut through the morning mist when they passed the last house on the colonel's property. Benedita could see through the window a woman preparing breakfast for her family. The smell of hot bread reached them, carried by the breeze, making the children's stomachs rumble with hunger. But there was no time to stop, no right to ask. The dirt road wound between hills covered with coffee plantations in different stages of growth. At some points, one could see in the distance the big houses of the larger farms, with their wide verandas and tended gardens. In others, only the native forest resisted, creating pockets of cool shade where little birds sang oblivious to the human drama unfolding on the road. It was Manuel who first noticed the change in the sky. "Mother, look there behind the mountain." The clouds accumulating on the horizon had that particular dark color of summer storms in the Paraíba Valley. They looked like black mountains walking toward them, charged with an electricity that made hair stand on end. "Has a big storm," murmured Jose, who had an almost animal instinct for predicting weather. Benedita looked around, calculating the distance to Barra do Piraí. They were still halfway when the first drops began to fall. They were thick, hot drops that raised small clouds of dust when touching the dry ground. "Mother, there's a house there," shouted Caterina, pointing to a construction that was barely distinguishable among the trees. But when they approached, they discovered it was just an abandoned chapel, roofless with partially collapsed walls. It offered no protection against what was approaching. The wind began to blow strongly, bending tree branches and lifting dry leaves in whirlwinds. The smell of rain, that unmistakable aroma of wet earth and vegetation, became more intense. Benedito began to cry, frightened by the thunder that echoed increasingly close. "We have to find shelter," said Felisberto, shouting to be heard over the wind noise. It was then that the first lightning began to cut the sky like silver knives. They illuminated the landscape for a few seconds, revealing the world in sharp and frightening details, before plunging it back into the charged darkness. The rain, when it finally began in earnest, wasn't gradual. It crashed down on them like a waterfall, soaking them completely in a matter of seconds. The dirt road turned to mud, the bundles became heavy as stone, and walking became a balancing exercise between puddles that formed quickly. Benedita hugged Benedito tighter, trying to protect him from the horizontal rain that lashed their faces. The other children pressed against her, forming a small compact group that fought against the elements. "There!" shouted Manuel, pointing to something they could barely distinguish through the curtain of water. "A big tree!" It was more than a big tree. It was a gigantic century-old wild fig tree, with a trunk so wide that 6 men couldn't embrace it. But most impressive was what had been built among its branches. A wooden structure, like a house suspended in the air, accessible by a crude ladder nailed to the trunk. Benedita looked up, trying to see through the rain and dense leaves. It seemed impossible, but someone had built a dwelling in that colossal tree. And at that moment, with the storm roaring around and her children soaked and cold, that improvised refuge seemed like the most welcoming place in the world. "Climb up!" she shouted to the children, first pushing Katerina toward the ladder. "Quick!" One by one, they climbed the slippery Arira steps, carrying heavy bundles and fighting against the wind that threatened to tear them from the tree. Benedita was the last to climb, with Benedito clinging to her neck, praying that the structure would hold everyone's weight. When they finally reached the wooden platform and pushed open the door of what seemed to be a small house built among the branches, they discovered they had found more than a simple shelter. They had found a mystery that would change their lives forever. The first sensation upon entering the treehouse was one of absolute amazement. It wasn't the rustic shelter they had imagined looking from below, but a careful and well-planned construction, with peroba plank walls fitted with precision and a roof that didn't let through even a drop of the torrential rain that was punishing outside. The space was approximately 5 meters long by 4 wide, more spacious than the living room of the house where they lived. The floor was made of wide, well-polished planks, and there were windows with wooden shutters that could be opened to let in light and air, but which now remained closed against the storm. But what most surprised Benedita were the furnishings. There was a solid jacaranda table, 2 chairs of the same material, a worked wooden chest, and even a small bookshelf with some leather-bound books. Everything seemed to have been made by skillful hands, by someone who understood not only carpentry, but how to create a welcoming space. The children spread throughout the room, still dripping water from their soaked clothes, but with eyes shining with curiosity and relief. Felisberto examined the wall structure, testing the solidity of the construction with the premature experience he had acquired helping with house repairs on the farm. The twins ran to the windows, peeking through the shutters to see the storm from above. "Mother, there are blankets here," exclaimed Katerina, opening the wooden chest. They were thick wool blankets, a bit dusty but in perfect state of conservation. There were also some simple kitchen utensils, iron pots, common earthenware plates, cutlery that wasn't silver but had been well cared for. Benedita took Benedito out of his wet clothes and wrapped him in one of the blankets. The boy stopped crying immediately, warm and fascinated by being so high off the ground. She herself was trying to process what they had found. Who had built this? Why was it abandoned? And for how long could they stay there? "Look at this, Mother," said José, pointing to the back wall. Hanging on the wall was a small oratory with the image of Saint Benedict, the black saint who protected the poorest. In front of the image, a well-worn wax candle and a rosary of dark beads, as if someone had recently prayed there. The rain continued falling violently, and lightning illuminated the interior of the house through the window cracks. But inside, protected by the wisdom of whoever had built that refuge, they were dry and safe. "I wonder if there's food?" asked Antonia, always practical in her concerns. It was Manuel who discovered, behind a plank that seemed to be part of the wall, but was actually a kind of secret pantry. There was rapadura in tablets, cassava flour stored in clay pots, jerky cut in strips, and even some coffee beans. It was the first time in months that they had before them the promise of an abundant meal. Benedita looked at the provisions with tears in her eyes, tears of gratitude for this unexpected providence, but also of concern. That food belonged to someone, and she had been raised not to take what wasn't hers. "Should we eat, Mother?" asked Katerina, reading the hesitation on her mother's face. Benedita looked at the children, thin, with soaked clothes, shivering with cold even inside the blanket. Benedito whimpered softly, asking for food in a language that only she could completely decipher. "Let's eat," she decided finally, "but only what's necessary so we don't go hungry. When the storm passes, we'll look for the owner of this place to pay for what we consume." While Katerina lit a small fire in the stone fireplace that had been built in a corner of the house, Benedita explored the environment more thoroughly. It was then that she noticed something strange. One of the floor planks seemed to be slightly loose, as if it had been removed and replaced recently. Curiosity overcame prudence. She carefully pushed the plank and discovered it was hiding a cavity in the floor, and inside that cavity was something that made her heart stop for a moment. A small, dark wooden chest, closed with a simple padlock that time had rusted. Benedita looked around to make sure the children were busy with food preparation. Then, with trembling hands, she lifted the chest. It was heavy, very heavy for its size, and when she shook it lightly, she could hear the unmistakable sound of metal hitting against metal. Coins. Many coins. With her heart beating rapidly, She examined the padlock. Rust had made the metal fragile, and with a little pressure, it opened. Slowly, almost fearfully, she lifted the chest's lid. What she saw made her sit heavily on the floor. Gold coins, Portuguese and Brazilian, some she had never seen before. More gold than she had ever imagined existed outside of fairy tales. There were also jewels, a pearl necklace, rings with precious stones, earrings that gleamed even in the fireplace's dim light. And at the bottom of the chest, carefully protected by a silk cloth, was a sealed envelope. With hands now trembling uncontrollably, she opened it. Inside, a letter written in careful handwriting, and sheets that seemed to be official documents. Benedita couldn't read, but she recognized numbers. And the numbers she saw in those papers were much, much larger than the 250,000 reis she owed the colonel. Outside, the storm continued roaring, but inside the treehouse, there was a tense silence. Benedita had found wealth enough to solve all her problems, to give her children a prosperous future, to never again have to worry about money. But there was something in that letter, something in the careful way everything was stored, that told her that fortune wasn't there by chance. Someone had hidden it for a very specific reason, and until she discovered what that reason was, she couldn't, in good conscience, touch a single coin. The moral dilemma of her life had just begun. The letter trembled in Benedita's hands as she tried to decipher the words written in elegant and careful calligraphy. Even without knowing how to read completely, some words jumped out at her. Dates, names, numbers she recognized, and there was something in the way the paper was folded, in the delicacy with which it had been stored, that spoke of an importance that went beyond money. "Felisberto," she called softly, without taking her eyes off the paper. "Come here, son." The boy approached, still chewing a piece of rapadura. His 14 years had given him basic knowledge of letters, learned from the chapel priest during the Sundays, when they managed to attend Mass. "Can you read this, my son?" Felisberto took the letter carefully, frowning in concentration. The firelight danced over the yellowed paper, and he had to move closer to distinguish the words. 12th of March, 1834, he began, reading slowly. "I Felisberto Joaquim de Moraes y Silva, 58 years old, dying and without direct descendants, leave these words as testament to my last will." The boy's voice failed for a moment, as if the weight of those words was too great for his age. Benedita signaled for him to continue. "All my fortune, including the gold coins I gathered during a life of honest work, the jewels that belonged to my deceased wife Donna Mariana, and the land grant papers that prove my legitimate possession of the lands of Fazenda São Sebastião, I leave as inheritance to my nephew Inácio de Moraes, today 28 years old, residing in the vicinity of Vassouras." Benedita felt a chill in her stomach. That fortune had an owner, a legitimate owner who probably didn't even know of its existence. "Continue, son. Inácio is a good man, but was unjustly accused of debts he didn't contract by dishonest merchants from the court. He lost almost everything he possessed to pay forged debts. This inheritance should restore the dignity and position that were stolen from him." Felisberto paused to breathe, then continued. "I hide this fortune in the house I built in the centenary fig tree, where I spent my last months in prayer and penance. May God guide this letter to the right hands, and may my soul find peace knowing that an injustice has been repaired." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of rain on the roof and the crackling of wood in the fireplace. Caterina and the twins had stopped moving, sensing that something important was happening. Only Benedito continued playing, oblivious to the magnitude of what had just been revealed. "There's more, Mother," said Felisberto, turning the page. "I sign this letter in the year of our Lord 1834, knowing that my days are numbered. If someone finds this letter and this fortune, I beg by Christian charity that it be delivered to its rightful heir. It is not my will that these riches serve as temptation for less prepared souls, but rather as redemption for the one who was wronged." Benedita closed her eyes and leaned her head against the wooden wall. 15 years had passed since that letter was written. 15 years during which Inácio de Moraes had probably fought against poverty and dishonor, while his legitimate inheritance remained hidden in a tree in the middle of the forest. "Mother," said Caterina slowly, "what are we going to do?" It was a simple question from an 11-year-old girl, but it contained all the complexity of the situation. There was wealth enough to transform their lives. They could pay the debt to the colonel, buy a good house in Barra do Piraí, give the children quality education. Felisberto wouldn't need to bend his back in the coffee plantations anymore. Caterina could learn to play piano. The twins could study in a real school. But there was also the voice of conscience, educated by years of catechism and nightly prayers. The fortune wasn't theirs. There was a legitimate heir, a man who might need that money as much as they did. First, let's have dinner, she decided, carefully storing the letter and closing the chest. Then we'll think calmly. The meal was the best they had had in months. The cassava flour became rich faroffa with the jerky, the rapadura sweetened the strong coffee, and there was even a can of guava preserve that made Antonia's eyes shine with joy. But Benedita could barely eat, her stomach tight with the anguish of the decision she would have to make. When the children finally fell asleep, wrapped in wool blankets under the soothing sound of rain that had diminished to a constant drizzle, she knelt before the image of St. Benedict. Her morning hands held the rosary of dark beads, and her lips whispered the prayers her mother had taught her in childhood. "Lord," she murmured softly, "show me the right path. My children are hungry, we have nowhere to go, and here is the solution, Blooms. But if this wealth belongs to another, how can I take it for myself?" The black saint looked at her with his painted wooden eyes, and she imagined seeing in them a compassionate understanding. Saint Benedict knew poverty, knew the temptations it brought, also knew the value of honesty even when it cost everything one had. Hours later, when the first light of morning began to filter through the window cracks, Benedita had made her decision. It was a decision that could cost them the only chance of prosperity they would have in life, but it was also the only decision that would allow her to look into her children's eyes without feeling shame. She would find Ignacio de Moraes and deliver his inheritance to him. Whatever happened afterward, at least she would know she had done what was right. And as she watched her children sleep peacefully, protected by the wisdom of a man dead for 15 years, she prayed that her honesty would be rewarded in some way she still couldn't imagine. Dawn brought a deceptive calm. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and perfumed with the smell of wet earth and washed vegetation. Through the windows of the treehouse, Benedita could see a transformed world. The coffee plantations dripped water crystals that shone like diamonds under the first rays of sun, and a light mist rose from the fields, creating an almost magical atmosphere. But inside her chest the storm continued. Throughout the night, even after making the decision, she had stayed awake, looking at the closed chest, fighting against thoughts that seemed to come from the tempter himself. "Nobody knows you found this," whispered a voice in her mind. 15 years have passed. Maybe this Ignacio is already dead. Maybe he moved far away. Your children need this fortune more than a stranger you've never seen." Each argument seemed logical, reasonable. She looked at Benedito, still small and vulnerable, and imagined how that money could guarantee him a dignified future. She saw Caterina, so intelligent, and thought about the education she could give her. She saw Felisberto, already bent by premature work, and dreamed of freeing him from this life of toil. But whenever these thoughts gained strength, she looked at the image of St. Benedict in the oratory and remembered the words her mother had repeated so many times. "Daughter, wealth that isn't ours can become a curse. God sees everything and pays well those who do good." "Mother, can I ask something?" Caterina's voice brought her back to the present moment. The girl was sitting in one of the jacaranda chairs, combing her still damp hair with a comb she had found among the house's belongings. Even with the rags they wore as clothes, there was a natural dignity in her daughter that always touched Benedita's heart. "You can, daughter. Are you really going to return the gold to that man?" The direct question caught her off guard. Caterina had always been observant, but her maturity sometimes frightened. "Why do you ask that?" "Because I saw how you looked at those coins last night. I saw that you thought about keeping them." The girl hadn't stopped combing her hair, but her voice was loaded with a seriousness that went beyond her 11 years. "I thought about it too. We all thought about it." Benedita approached and knelt before her daughter, holding her small hands already calloused from work. "And what do you think we should do?" "I think you've already decided, and I think you decided right." Caterina smiled, and in that smile was an understanding that made Benedita's eyes fill with tears. "Papa always said we were poor in money, but rich in character. If we take this gold, we'll become rich in money, but poor in character." Her daughter's wisdom left her speechless. How could a child see with such clarity what she herself had taken an entire night to understand? "Besides," continued Caterina, "imagine how this man, this Ignacio, must have suffered all these years, thinking he was alone in the world. Imagine his joy when he learns that someone remembered him." At that moment, Benedita knew she had raised a special daughter, and she also knew that, regardless of the difficulties they would face, She had transmitted to the children something more valuable than any amount of gold: the ability to distinguish right from wrong, even when wrong seemed easier. Felisberto and the twins woke up shortly after, followed by Antonia, who carried Benedito in her arms. The morning meal was made with the same provisions from the night before, but this time there was a different lightness in the air. The children knew of their mother's decision, and there was in them a mixture of apprehension and pride. "Where are we going to look for this gentleman?" asked Felisberto, while helping to store their belongings. "Vassouras," answered Benedita. The letter said he lived in the vicinity of Vassouras. It was a journey of at least 2 days on foot, passing through farms and villages she knew only by hearsay. But there was no other choice. They had to find Ignacio de Moraes and deliver his inheritance to him. Before leaving, she made sure to leave the house exactly as they had found it. She washed the utensils they used, folded the blankets, swept the wooden floor. She also left some small coins she had in her pocket, pennies she had saved with such sacrifice, but which represented payment for the food they consumed. The chest with the treasure was carefully wrapped in one of the calico quilts and placed at the bottom of the bag, along with the documents. It was a literal and figurative weight that Benedita would carry until she found its rightful owner. When they finally came down from the tree, Benedito cried a little, missing that magical place that had been his first truly comfortable home. But Benedita consoled him in her arms, whispering that sometimes we have to leave good places to find even better things. The sun was high when they set out for Vassouras, following the dirt road that cut through coffee plantations and small settlements. The landscape of the Paraíba Valley stretched before them in green waves, dotted by the big houses of farms and the yards where coffee dried in the sun. Benedita walked with firm steps, the heavy bag on her back, carrying not only a stranger's fortune, but also the weight of a moral choice that would define her family's character forever. And as they walked, she couldn't know that that seemingly simple decision, to return what wasn't hers, was about to change their lives in a way that not even her most daring dreams could imagine. The road to Vassouras proved longer and more rugged than Benedita had imagined. For 2 days they followed the main trail that cut through the heart of the Paraíba Valley, passing farms whose gates bore coats of arms and pompous names, crossing crystal-clear streams where they stopped to quench their thirst and rest their aching feet. The children walked in silence most of the time, instinctively understanding the gravity of the mission they had embraced. Felisberto helped carry the heaviest belongings, while Caterina took care of Benedito, during moments when the little one grew too tired to walk. The twins explored the road's margins, finding wild fruits that supplemented the family's meager diet. On the first night, they slept in the open under a flowering yellow ipe tree, wrapped in calico quilts and protected by a fire that Felisberto kept burning throughout the dawn. The second night found them on the porch of an abandoned chapel, where they shared space with some muleteers heading to Rio de Janeiro, carrying coffee from regional farms. It was one of the muleteers, a dark and experienced man named João Batista, who gave them the first information about Ignacio de Moraes. "I know that name, yes," he said, lighting a straw cigarette while the fire crackled between them. "Reserved man, lives on a somewhat decadent farm near Vassouras. They say he was once rich but lost everything at a bad time. Lives alone with a few old slaves he didn't want to sell, even while struggling with need." "Where exactly is this farm?" asked Benedita, feeling her heart accelerate. "São Sebastião Farm, about 3 hours' walk along the Royal Road after you reach Vassouras. Can't miss it. It's the only big house in the region that needs a coat of paint." João Batista drew on the smoke and released it slowly. "But can I ask what business you have with him?" "Family matter," she replied evasively. The muleteer respected the silence and didn't insist, but she could see the curiosity in his eyes. A poor woman with 6 children looking for a decadent landowner wasn't something one saw every day. Vassouras, when they finally reached the city at the end of the second day's afternoon, impressed with its prosperity. It was the heart of the coffee region, with imposing mansions, stone-paved streets, and constant movement of carts loaded with coffee sacks. The smell of roasted beans permeated the air, mixed with food aromas coming from houses and commercial establishments. Benedita stopped first at the main church, where she found the priest organizing vestments for evening mass. He was an elderly man with white hair and kind eyes, who received her with the characteristic patience of someone accustomed to dealing with parishioners' problems. "Father, do you know Senor Ignacio de Moraes from São Sebastião Farm?" "I do know him, my daughter. A good man, but very solitary. He comes to mass occasionally." always sitting in the last pew, always alone. The priest paused and studied her attentively. "Forgive the curiosity, but what need do you have of him?" "It's about an inheritance, Father, an inheritance that belongs to him." The clergyman's eyes lit up with a mixture of surprise and hope. "An inheritance? Praise be to God. This man has gone through great tribulations. 15 years ago, he was one of the most prosperous farmers in the region, but was victim to unscrupulous merchants who forged debt documents against him. He lost almost everything he possessed trying to pay debts he never contracted." Benedita felt a tightness in her chest. The priest's words confirmed exactly what was written in Felisberto Joaquim de Moraes e Silva's letter. How does he live now? With dignity, but in great simplicity. He maintains a few elderly slaves whom he considers family. He never wanted to sell them even when need pressed. He cultivates a small garden, raises some chickens. He's a man who learned to live with little, but never lost the goodness of his heart. The children listened to the conversation in silence, and Caterina approached her mother. "Mother, now I'm certain we're doing the right thing." The priest indicated the direction to São Sebastião farm and offered them lodging at the parish house, but Benedita preferred to continue the journey immediately. There was a growing urgency in her heart, a need to complete that mission before losing courage. The road to the farm was narrower, bordered by coffee plantations that extended as far as the eye could see, but it was possible to perceive, in the details, the signs of decay the priest had mentioned. The coffee bushes needed pruning, some fences were broken, and the big house that appeared in the distance really needed a coat of paint. When they finally reached the wooden gate of São Sebastião farm, the sun was already setting behind the mountains, tinting the sky with golden and orange tones that made the landscape seem painted by a divine artist. And there, sitting on the big house's veranda, was a man with greyish beard and simple clothes, reading a book in the light of the day's last hours. When he saw the family approaching, he raised his eyes and observed them with an expression of curiosity mixed with caution. Benedita took a deep breath, adjusted the bag on her back where she carried the chest with the inheritance, and prepared for the encounter that would change 2 lives forever. "Good afternoon," she said, making a small curtsy. "Are you Inácio de Moraes?" The man slowly closed the book and stood up, studying that unlikely group that had appeared at his property at day's end. "I am. How can I help you?" The voice was polite, gentle, but carried the caution of someone who had learned to distrust strangers. Benedita swallowed hard, knowing that the words she was about to speak would sound impossible, but that carrying the truth was the only possible path. "Sir, my name is Benedita Joaquina da Conceição, and I bring news that you perhaps won't believe. I bring news of your uncle, Felisberto Joaquim de Moraes e Silva." And at that moment, she saw something change in the face of the man before her. A start, a hope he tried to hide, but which shone in his eyes like the flame of a candle lit in the darkness. The silence that followed the mention of the deceased uncle was so profound that even the birds seemed to cease their evening song. Inácio de Moraes remained motionless for several seconds, as if the name pronounced by that unknown woman had awakened memories long dormant. "My uncle Felisberto." His voice came out hoarse, loaded with ancient emotions. He died 15 years ago. How can—" Benedita carefully opened the bag and removed the dark wooden chest, placing it on the ground between them. The symbolic weight of the moment made her hands tremble slightly. "We found this hidden in the treehouse he built. There was a letter addressed to you, a letter that explains everything." Inácio descended the veranda steps with hesitant steps, as if he feared this might be a cruel dream. When he knelt before the chest, his hands that Benedita noticed were educated, despite the calluses of work, touched the wood with the reverence of someone touching a sacred relic. "The treehouse," he murmured. "I knew he had isolated himself in his last months of life, but I never imagined—" His voice was lost as he looked at the broken lock. You saw what's inside here?" "We did see, sir." Benedita's answer was direct, honest. "That's why we're here." Slowly, Inácio opened the chest. The gold shone in the golden light of sunset, and the jewels seemed to capture and reflect all the beauty of the painted sky. But what most caught Benedita's attention was the expression on the man's face. It wasn't greed or even joy. It was relief, a deep and painful relief, like someone who had carried a terrible weight for a long time and could finally let it fall. "The documents," he said, carefully taking the papers. "These are the original land grant papers of the farm, the ones that prove that the debts—" His voice failed, and for the first time in 15 years, Ignacio de Moraes cried. They weren't tears of sadness, but of a liberation that had seemed impossible. Benedita instinctively approached, and without thinking twice, placed a consoling hand on the shoulder of that man who was a complete stranger, but who at that moment seemed like a brother in suffering. The court merchants, he managed to say between tears. They forged documents, invented debts I never contracted. I lost everything trying to prove my innocence. My wife died of heartbreak, my children. I never managed to give them the life they deserved. Felisberto, who had remained silent until then, approached and offered the letter to the man. Your uncle left this for you. He knew everything. With hands trembling with emotion, Ignacio read Felisberto Joaquim's letter. As his eyes traveled over the lines, his expression changed, from disbelief to understanding, from understanding to a gratitude that seemed to overflow from his chest. He knew, he whispered. He always knew I was innocent. And he kept this for me all these years. Not just for you, said Caterina, with the wisdom that always characterized her. He kept it so the truth would be known. Ignacio looked at the girl, then at each of Benedita's children, finally fixing his eyes on the woman herself, who had renounced a fortune to do justice. You could have kept all of this. A family in need, an abandoned fortune. Who would blame you? Our conscience would blame us, answered Benedita simply, and our children would learn that it's possible to live well at the expense of dishonesty. At that moment, while the sun set completely behind the mountains and the first stars began to appear in the dark sky, Ignacio de Moraes did something that would change the destiny of everyone present. He stood up, wiped the tears from his face, and looked directly into Benedita's eyes. From today, this farm is as much yours as mine. You didn't just return my inheritance. You returned my dignity, my faith in human goodness. How can I repay such honesty? You don't need to repay anything, sir. We only did what was right. Then allow me to do what's right too. His voice had gained a new firmness, an authority that years of humiliation had hidden but not destroyed. Stay here. Help me rebuild this farm. Be my family, as I never managed to have one. Benedita looked at the children, saw the tiredness on each face, but also the hope that shone in their eyes. She looked at the big house that needed repairs, at the coffee plantations that needed care, at that man who had found in their honesty a reason to live again. If this is God's will, she said finally, then we'll stay. And that night, for the first time in 3 years, Benedita and her children slept with the certainty that they had found not just a roof, but a home built on the most solid foundations that exist: honesty, gratitude, and selfless goodness. Outside, São Sebastião Farm awakened from a long sleep, ready to be reborn under the care of a family that had proven there were still people capable of choosing good, even when it cost everything they had. The first days at São Sebastião Farm were like awakening from a long and tiring dream to discover that reality could be even better. Ignacio de Moraes revealed himself to be a man of his word and generous heart, treating Benedita and her children not as tenants or employees, but as the family he had lost long ago. The big house, despite needing repairs, was spacious and welcoming. It had 4 large bedrooms, a wide living room with jacaranda furniture that recalled times of prosperity, a kitchen with a wood stove, and an extensive veranda from which one could contemplate the entire valley. For the first time in years, the children could run freely through the rooms without bumping into each other. Ignacio entirely entrusted the house's administration to Benedita, recognizing in her a natural competence for organization that her years of widowhood had refined. She assumed the task with the seriousness of someone who had finally found a purpose greater than mere survival. "Donna Benedita," he said on the first morning while they had coffee on the veranda, "I would like you to administer not just the house, but everything related to life on the farm. The slaves who remain are few and already elderly: Pai João, Tia Maria, and Benedito Velho. They need care as much as direction." It was a responsibility that honored and at the same time frightened her. Managing a farm, even a decadent one, was very different from administering a small house. But there was something in the trust placed by Ignacio that awakened in her an energy she hadn't felt in years. Felisberto, with his 14 years and premature experience in rural work, became Ignacio's right hand in recovering the coffee plantations. The boy had a natural intuition for agriculture that impressed the landowner, and a dedication that contrasted with his youth. "This boy has in his hands the gift to make the land produce," commented Ignazio to Benedita, watching Felisberto direct a team of hired workers in pruning the coffee bushes. "With proper guidance, he can become one of the best farmers in the region." Caterina took charge of educating the younger siblings, but also proved to be an excellent seamstress. With fine fabrics she found in a chest belonging to the former lady of the house, she began making decent clothes for the entire family. Her small hands seemed blessed when it came to cutting and sewing. The twins, Manuel and José, explored every corner of the property, learning its possibilities and limitations. They discovered an abandoned orchard that could be recovered, springs that could feed an irrigation system, and even a small quarry from which material could be extracted for repairs. Antonia, at 6 years old, won the heart of Tia Maria, the elderly cook who had remained on the farm for lack of anywhere else to go. The girl quickly learned the secrets of rural cooking, and her childish laughter brought joy back to a kitchen that had known only silence for a long time. Benedito, the youngest, became the joy of Pai Juan, the farm's oldest slave. The old man who had lost his own children, sold while still small, found in the boy a reason to smile again. He taught him old songs and stories from the time when the farm was prosperous, but it was the partnership between Benedita and Ignazio that most impressed everyone. They complemented each other naturally, she with her practical sense and organizational ability, he with his education and knowledge about agricultural business. There was between them a mutual respect that grew each day, built on the solid foundation of gratitude and reciprocal admiration. "Donna Benedita," said Ignazio one afternoon, while they reviewed plans for the next harvest, "you brought life back to this house, not just through your children, but through your presence." This farm had forgotten what it was like to have a lady caring for its details. She blushed slightly, but kept focus on the numbers they were discussing. "You gave me an opportunity when I most needed it. It's natural that I do the best I can." "It's not just that," he insisted. "You have a gift for making things work. In 2 weeks you managed to organize this house better than I did in 15 years trying alone." It was true. Benedita had transformed the farm into a place where everything had its place and every person had their function. There was a harmony in daily life that hadn't existed for a long time, a sense of collective purpose that benefited everyone. At night, when the children slept and the day's work was finished, she and Ignazio would talk on the veranda, planning improvements and sharing experiences. These were conversations that began as work meetings, but gradually transformed into something deeper, a friendship based on mutual understanding and shared vision of the future. "When the next harvest is sold," said Ignazio one of those nights, "I want you to receive 40% of the profits, not as payment but as partnership. This farm only prospers because you're here. 40% is too much." "It's little for what you brought back to my life," he interrupted firmly. "Honor, hope, family. How can one price that?" Benedita looked at the stars shining over the valley, thinking about the impossible journey that had brought her there. 3 months before, she was a desperate widow about to lose everything. Now, she was partner in a recovering farm, mother of children who finally had a future, a woman respected in a community that was learning to admire her. And all because she had chosen to do what was right, even when it seemed to cost her the only chance of prosperity she would have in life. While listening to the distant sound of crickets and feeling the night breeze perfumed with the smell of coffee in bloom, she knew that God had mysterious ways of rewarding honesty, ways that not even the most daring imagination could anticipate. 8 months after arriving at Saint Sebastian Farm, the first harvest under the new administration was ready. What had been a decadent property had transformed into a model farm, where each coffee bush had been carefully pruned, each row cleaned of weeds, each bean harvested at the exact moment of ripeness. Benedita woke before dawn, as she always did, but this time there was special energy in the air. It was the day they would discover if all the months of hard work had been worthwhile. She wore her best dress, a blue cotton dress that Caterina had sewn with fabric bought in the city itself, and arranged her hair in a careful bun. It had been a long time since she felt so respectable. In the kitchen she found Tia Maria already preparing breakfast for the workers who would arrive early to begin the harvest. The old slave, whom Ignazio now treated more like a free employee, smiled upon seeing her. "Donna Benedita, you look beautiful today. Special day, isn't it?" "Yes, Tia Maria. Day to see if our work bore fruit." Outside, one could already hear the movement of temporary workers that Ignazio had hired for the harvest. Men and women from the region who knew that Saint Sebastian farm now paid fair wages and offered abundant meals. The farm's reputation had changed drastically in the region. Felisberto appeared in the kitchen already dressed in his work clothes, but there was something different about him. At 15, he had become a respected young man whose opinions on agriculture were heard even by more experienced farmers. His posture was erect. His eyes shone with the confidence of someone who knew his worth. "Mother, Senor Ignazio is waiting for you in the office." A visitor arrived. Benedita dried her hands on her apron and headed to the office, a room that Ignazio had completely reorganized, with the land grant documents framed on the wall as proof of his legal rehabilitation. Inside, she found him talking with an elegantly dressed man she didn't recognize. "Ah, Donna Benedita," said Ignazio, standing with the courtesy he always showed in her presence. "This is Senor Antonio Ferreira da Silva, coffee merchant from Rio de Janeiro." The man greeted her with a respect she wasn't accustomed to receiving from people of his social position. There was something in his way of treating her that indicated Saint Sebastian farm's reputation had reached even the court. "Donna Benedita, I've heard much about this farm's administration. They say the coffee quality has improved extraordinarily under your supervision. The merit belongs to everyone's work, sir, and mainly to Senor Ignacio's guidance." "Don't be modest," intervened Ignacio. "Donna Benedita organized this farm in a way I never managed in 15 years trying alone." The merchant smiled and opened a leather briefcase he had brought. "Well then, I come to make a proposal. I would like to buy your entire production this year and sign a contract for the next 3 years. The price I offered Senor Ignazio is here." Benedita looked at the paper he extended to her and felt her legs weaken. The amount was 3 times larger than what Ignazio had estimated for the harvest. It was money enough to completely transform their lives, to guarantee the children's future, to definitively consolidate the farm's prosperity. It's a very generous amount," she managed to murmur. "It's the fair price for exceptionally quality coffee, and from what I know, the quality is guaranteed by the attention to detail that you implemented here." After the merchant left, leaving the signed contract and an advance in gold that made Benedita's eyes shine, she and Ignazio remained silent in the office, still processing the magnitude of what had happened. 40% of this," said Ignazio finally, indicating the money on the table, "is yours by right." Benedita looked at the amount. It was more money than she had imagined possessing in her entire life. Money enough to buy a house in the city, to give the children refined education, to never again worry about survival. "Senor Ignazio," she said slowly, "there's something I need to confess to you." He looked at her with curiosity and a bit of apprehension. "When we found your uncle's treasure, I spent an entire night tempted to keep it, imagining how that gold could solve all our problems. It was the most difficult night of my life. And what made you decide on the right path?" "My children. I didn't want them to learn that it's possible to prosper dishonestly. I wanted them to grow up knowing that there's reward for those who do good." Ignazio approached and, with a delicacy that surprised her, held her hands. "Donna Benedita, you taught me that there are still truly good people in the world. And more than that, you taught me that these people are rewarded, not just in the other world, but in this one too." It was at that moment that the last visitor of that memorable day arrived. Joaquim, the former foreman of Colonel Augusto de Almeida Barros, appeared at the farm gate mounted on a sweaty horse as if he had traveled in haste. "Donna Benedita," he said without dismounting, "the colonel sends word that he's willing to buy all your farm's coffee for double the price any merchant would offer." Benedita exchanged a glance with Ignazio and smiled. It was the final confirmation that they had made the right choices. "Tell the colonel we appreciate the offer," she responded with a dignity that made Joaquim straighten in his saddle. "But our coffee already has a buyer, and he paid the fair price, not double, because our coffee is worth exactly what it's worth, no more, no less." When Joaquim left, visibly upset, Benedita felt that a cycle had closed. The desperate woman who had been expelled from the colonel's lands no longer existed. In her place was a respected farmer, partner of one of the region's most promising properties, mother of children who had a guaranteed future, and all because, on a stormy night, she had chosen honesty over convenience. That night, while celebrating the harvest's success with the children, Benedita looked around the abundant table and thought of her mother's wisdom. God sees everything and pays well those who do good. Some accounts, she discovered, are paid with interest of gratitude, respect, and love, and those were the best of all. 2 years had passed since the day of the first victorious harvest, and São Sebastião farm had transformed into one of the most prosperous and respected properties in the Paraíba Valley. More than that, it had become a model of how a farm could be administered with justice, efficiency, and human dignity. Benedita, now 32 years old, carried herself with a natural elegance that the well-sewn dresses by Caterina only enhanced. Her hair, always pinned in an impeccable bun, had gained some silver strands that she didn't worry about hiding. They were medals of honor for challenges overcome and responsibilities embraced. The big house had been completely restored. The walls received new paint in soft tones. The old furniture was recovered with the care of someone who recognized its historical value, and careful gardens flourished in spaces that before were occupied only by weeds. It was a house that radiated discreet prosperity and family harmony. Felisberto, at 17 years old, had officially become the farm's overseer. His authority was respected by workers not only for his competence, but for the justice with which he treated everyone. There was in him a maturity that impressed visitors, but also the kindness his mother had taught him since childhood. "Mother," he said one afternoon, finding Benedita on the veranda where she embroidered a trousseau for one of Tia Maria's daughters who would marry soon, "the village priest wants to talk with you about a school." "School?" "He thinks you should teach other women to read and write. He says you have a gift for education." It was true. Benedita had learned to read with Ignacio's help during the first months on the farm, and later taught the younger daughters. Her patience and method had caught the attention of the local priest, who saw in her a possible solution for women's education in the region. Caterina, now 14 years old, had become a young woman of discreet but striking beauty. Her embroidery was sought after by the most elegant families of Vassouras, and she herself designed patterns with a creativity that surprised those who saw them. But beyond skill with needles, she was also developing a natural talent for teaching. "Caterina could help me with the school," thought Benedita aloud. "She has more patience than I do for teaching the more delicate points." The twins, Manuel and José, at 12 years old, had specialized in different aspects of the farm. Manuel showed aptitude for business, accompanying Ignacio on trips to sell coffee and learning about commerce and finance. José preferred direct work with the land, developing innovative techniques for irrigation and planting that increased productivity. Antonia, at 9 years old, was the heart of the house. Her contagious joy and natural capacity to care for others made her the favorite of all farm residents. Tia Maria said she had blessed hands for healing, as any wound or illness seemed to improve with her simple but caring treatments. Benedito, the youngest at 6 years old, had grown strong and intelligent. Pai João had become his informal teacher, teaching him about medicinal plants, nature observation, and the ancient secrets of rural life. The boy showed a lively intelligence that promised much for the future. The farm's prosperity had allowed Ignacio to do something he had desired for a long time. He legally prosecuted the merchants who had forged the documents 15 years before. With the help of papers left by his uncle and the money necessary to hire good lawyers, he managed not only to definitively clear his name, but also to recover part of the lands he had been forced to sell. "Donna Benedita," he said one afternoon, while they walked through the blooming coffee plantations, "there's something I've been thinking about for a long time." She looked at him with curiosity. In the 2.5 years they had lived as partners and friends, she had learned to recognize when something important was on his mind. "Tell me, Señor Ignacio, have you ever thought about marrying again?" The question caught her off guard, although deep down she knew that day would come. There was between them a respect and affection that had grown gradually, based on mutual admiration and shared life. "Sometimes," she admitted, "when I see how good it would be for the children to have a father figure more present, and when I think it would be natural, after so much time of widowhood. So, would you consider a marriage proposal, if it came from the right person?" Benedita stopped walking and looked directly into his eyes. She saw in them the same honesty she had learned to admire, the same goodness that made him the respectable man he was. "It would depend on who that person was," she said with a smile that left the answer implicit. Ignacio smiled too, and at that moment, among the coffee plants loaded with white and fragrant flowers, two hearts that had found in each other the completeness they sought, sealed a silent commitment. The official proposal came the following week, made in the presence of all Benedita's children and the farm residents. It was a simple moment without pomp, but loaded with the dignity that characterized everything they did. "Donna Benedita Joaquina da Conceição," said Ignacio, kneeling before her on the big house veranda, "will you marry me and be my wife before God and men?" "I will," she responded, extending her hand so he could place the simple gold ring that had belonged to his first wife, with God's blessing and the joy of my children. The wedding was scheduled for 3 months later, sufficient time for preparations and for the news to spread throughout the region. It would be a celebration that would mark not only the union of two people, but the consolidation of a family that had formed through the strongest bonds that exist: gratitude, respect, and love built day by day. And on a special afternoon that same month, an unexpected visit arrived at the farm that brought confirmation that their story had surpassed the limits of their own life. It was an old muleteer who had heard the story of the tree and returned treasure in a distant village, told in Cordel verses by a traveling poet. He came specifically to meet the woman who had chosen honesty even when it could cost her everything. "Donna Benedita," he said, respectfully removing his hat, "I came from far away just to say that you are an example for all of us. May God bless you for the good you did." That night, while contemplating the stars from the veranda of her prosperous house, surrounded by happy children and beside the man who would be her husband, Benedita understood that she had received much more than she had given. She had planted honesty and harvested dignity. She had sown justice and reaped love. And the centenary tree where everything had begun continued there, on the neighboring property, now transformed into a small sanctuary where people came to give thanks for graces received, because some stories, she discovered, become larger than the people who live them and inspire other people to always choose the path of good. The autumn of 1894 tinted the Paraíba Valley with golden tones that seemed to bless each leaf, each branch, each memory built throughout 45 years of full life. Benedita Joaquina de Conceição, now Benedita de Moraes, at 75 years old, rested in the bed of the main bedroom of São Sebastião farm, surrounded by all those who had made her life worthwhile. The room was silent, but filled with a loving presence that made even that final moment a celebration. The white linen curtains filtered the soft afternoon light, creating an atmosphere of peace that reflected the serenity of that extraordinary woman. Felisberto, now a 59-year-old man and owner of his own lands, held his mother's right hand. He was a respected farmer throughout the region, known as much for his coffee quality as for his character's integrity. His own children, 5 in total, had in him an example of honesty that traced back to lessons learned in that treehouse so many decades before. Caterina, at 56 years old, had become the region's first certified teacher. Her school for young ladies, established with Benedita and Inácio's support, had educated 3 generations of women in the Paraíba Valley. She had never married, dedicating her life to education, but had found in intellectual motherhood a fulfillment that completed her entirely. The twins, Manuel and José, at 54 years old, had followed different but equally prosperous paths. Manuel had become a merchant at court, being one of those responsible for Brazilian coffee export to Europe. José had remained on the land, developing agricultural techniques that were studied even in the empire. Both had built solid families, transmitting to their children the values they learned from their mother. Antonia, at 51 years old, had discovered her vocation in religious life. She was Mother Superior of a convent in Vassouras, where she cared for orphans and taught trades to girls without family. Her natural goodness had found in life dedicated to God the fullest expression of her gifts. Benedito, the youngest at 50 years old, had become a doctor, the first in the family to earn a university degree. Graduated from Rio de Janeiro Medical School, he had returned to his natal region to care for the poor and needy. His clinic didn't charge those who couldn't pay, and his reputation as a lay saint had spread throughout the province. Inácio, at 89 years old, remained beside the bed, holding his wife's left hand. 45 years of marriage had consolidated one of the region's most respected unions. Together, they had built not only a prosperous farm, but a legacy of dignity that had influenced an entire generation. Benedita's breathing was soft, serene. There was no pain, no fear, only the tranquility of someone who had fulfilled her mission on earth with honor and dedication. "My daughter," she murmured to Caterina, "continue teaching the girls. Teach that education is the best dowry a woman can have." "Always, mother," answered Caterina with tears in her eyes. "Felisberto," her voice was weak but firm, "care for the land as it cared for us. The land is generous to those who treat it well." "Yes, mother, as you taught me." "Manuel José," she said, looking at the twins, "always remember that money is good when serving good people, but dangerous when people serve it." "We'll never forget, mother. they said in unison as they had since childhood. Antonia, my daughter, continue being God's hands for those who need, until the last day of my life, mother. And you, Benedito, she said, smiling at the youngest who had become a doctor. Do you remember that day in the tree when you were small? I remember, mother. It was there that everything began. It was there that we learned that doing good is always worthwhile, even when it seems it will cost us everything. She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering strength for the last words she wanted to leave. Ignazio, my love, she whispered to her husband. Thank you for showing me that love can be born from gratitude and grow to become the most beautiful thing in the world. Thank you, Benedita. You taught me that there are still angels on earth. I want you to know, she said, looking at all the children, that the greatest wealth of my life wasn't the gold we found and returned. It was you. It was seeing you grow with dignity. It was knowing that in the world there are 6 good people because of the choices we made. The farm chapel bell began to ring 6 in the evening, as it had every day for 45 years. It was the signal for rosary prayer, a tradition that Benedita had instituted and that had never been interrupted. Prayer time, she murmured, smiling. Everyone knelt around the bed as they had done thousands of times throughout the decades. Ignazio began to pray the rosary with his voice choked with emotion, and the others accompanied. When they reached the last Hail Mary, Benedita whispered along, and her voice seemed to blend with the wind that blew softly through the open window. When the prayer ended, she had departed, serene as a leaf that detaches from the tree in autumn, her natural cycle complete. Outside the window, the centenary fig tree where everything had begun swayed gently in the evening breeze, as if it too paid its homage to that extraordinary woman. Benedita Joaquina da Conceicão's funeral was the largest Vasouras had ever witnessed. Came landowners and freed slaves, court merchants and poor tenants, priests and nuns, doctors and rural workers. An entire region paid its final homage to the woman who had proven that honesty was more valuable than gold. Ignazio, despite his 89 years, insisted on pronouncing the final words. His voice, though trembling with age and emotion, echoed clearly in the packed church. Benedita taught all of us that choosing good, even when it costs everything we have, is always the right path. She transformed an impossible debt into an eternal blessing, despair into hope, an end into a beginning. May God receive her in his arms, because she was already with him from the day she chose honesty over convenience. And while the cortege headed to the farm cemetery, where she would be buried under the shade of a centenary mango tree she had planted with her own hands, a story was completed. But its echo would continue resonating through generations, reminding all that some choices transcend time and become eternal lessons about the value of human dignity. At the fig tree where everything had begun, a simple wooden plaque had been placed years before. Here God rewarded the honesty of a just woman. May all who pass remember, doing good is always worthwhile, and it was indeed. It always would be. The year was 1920, 26 years after Benedita's death, and Brazil was no longer an empire but a young republic searching for its identity. The transformations had been profound. Slavery had been abolished, the monarchy overthrown, cities were growing rapidly. But at São Sebastião farm, now administered by Felisberto with his son's help, some values remained immutable. The centenary fig tree had officially become a sanctuary. A small but elegant chapel had been built at its base, maintaining the original hut in the tree's crown as a living museum of Benedita's story. Pilgrims came from various parts of the country to know the place where a simple woman had chosen honesty over easy wealth. That Sunday morning, a special group had gathered at the chapel, all of Benedita's living descendants, her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, for the annual celebration in her memory. There were more than 50 people, among children, youth, and adults, all bearing in their faces traces of the matriarch who had founded that lineage of dignified people. Ignazio had died 3 years before, at 95 years old, whispering on his deathbed that he would finally reunite with his Benedita. Even without the patriarch's physical presence, his influence was still felt in the firmness of principles he had helped consolidate in the family. Caterina, now 81 years old, was the family's eldest. Her completely white hair was pinned in the same bun her mother had worn, and in her eyes still shone the intelligence that had made her a respected educator. She had brought with her a copy of the book that had just been published, The Tree of Honesty, True Story of a Brazilian Family, written by one of her former students, based on the accounts she herself had provided. Mama always said our story wasn't ours alone, she said to the gathered family. It belonged to everyone who needed to believe that goodness still existed in the world. Felisberto, at 85 years old, still maintained the erect posture and firm gaze of his youth. He had 15 grandchildren and 23 great-grandchildren, and all had been raised hearing the story of the tree and the returned treasure. On his own farm, he maintained a free school where he taught modern agriculture to rural workers' children. "What most impresses me," he said, "is how Mama's decision that night continues generating fruits until today. Each one of us who chooses to do good is honoring that choice of hers." The twins, now 80 years old, had become respected public figures. Manuel was a Republic senator, known for his unshakable integrity and for laws that protected rural workers. Jose had developed agricultural techniques that helped small producers increase their productivity without degrading the environment. "Mama taught us that true wealth isn't measured in coins," said Jose. "It's measured in how many lives you manage to touch for the better. And that politics isn't about power," added Manuel. "It's about serving, like she served our family and our community." Antonia, at 77 years old, had left the convent to care for orphans in the city. Her house in Vasuras sheltered 12 abandoned children, all educated in the same principles she had learned from her mother. She had never married, but was a heartfelt grandmother to dozens of young people who had passed through her care. "Mama taught me that motherhood isn't only of blood," she said, smiling at the children she had brought to the celebration. "It's of love and dedication." Benedito, the youngest at 76 years old, had become a legend in regional medicine. His hospital in Barra do Piraí attended the poor for free, financed by payments from wealthier patients. He had 6 children, all following professions oriented toward public service: teachers, doctors, engineers dedicated to social works. "What Mama left us wasn't a material inheritance," he said. "It was a moral code, a way of seeing the world where doing good always matters more than taking advantage." After Mass celebrated by the local priest, the family headed to the farm cemetery, where Benedita's tomb was always covered with fresh flowers. The simple white marble headstone bore only her name, birth and death dates, and a phrase she herself had asked to be engraved. She did good while she could. But the celebration's most moving moment happened when Benedita's youngest grandson, an 8-year-old boy named Geraldo, in honor of the great-grandmother's first husband, climbed the tree using the ladder that was still there and came down carrying a small wooden box. "What's this, grandfather?" he asked Felisberto. "It's a new tradition we're starting today, my grandson. Each year on the great-grandmother's celebration day, we'll put in this box a coin and a letter telling about a good deed we did during the year. When you grow up and have your own children, they'll open the boxes from previous years and see how our family kept Benedita's lesson alive." The idea deeply touched everyone present. One by one, the families approached and placed their contributions in the box: coins representing savings destined for charity, letters relating help provided, social projects realized, lives touched by small gestures of kindness. When the ceremony ended and families began to disperse, Caterina remained alone for a few minutes before the tree. At 81 years old, she was the only one who still had clear memories of that stormy night in 1849, when everything had begun. She closed her eyes and could almost hear her mother's voice, soft but firm, explaining why they should return the gold to its rightful owner. She could almost smell the rain, feel the warmth of the improvised fireplace, the weight of the decision that would change their lives forever. "Thank you, Mama," she whispered to the wind. "You taught us that there's a wealth no one can steal, the certainty of having done what's right." A gentle breeze swayed the fig tree's leaves, and for a moment Caterina had the sensation that her mother was there, smiling, approving everything her family had become. That night, in the big house where she had grown up, and which now belonged to Felisberto, she opened a new notebook and began to write. "For the children of my children's children, who will read these words when I'm no longer here, you descend from a woman who on a stormy night chose honesty when she could have chosen wealth. That choice defines you to this day. May you never forget, some treasures are too great to be kept. They're made to be shared, to multiply good in the world." The true inheritance that Benedita Joaquina de Conceição left us wasn't gold or lands. It was the certainty that doing good is always worthwhile, always compensated, always rewarded. And as she wrote, she knew that story would continue being told, generation after generation, reminding everyone that it's still possible to live with dignity in a world that sometimes seems to have forgotten the value of honesty. The centenary fig tree would continue there, growing, blooming, giving shade and shelter, as an eternal symbol that some choices plant roots so deep they become immortal. Because doing good, as Benedita had proven with her life, always is worthwhile.